Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Today, we'll be talking about what your company should be doing in the wake of a layoff. And joining us to contribute to the conversation is Miriam Mima. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to have you. Can you share with our audience a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm one of those weird people on the planet who I knew very, very early in my life what I wanted to be doing. So I was 13 and adults started to tell me you should become a business psychologist. And I was like, you are right. I mean, I've loved psychology and business and interpersonal dynamics literally since I was a teenager. So yeah, I've basically, my sweet spot is working with people in the context of business and helping take what is not unnecessarily complex challenges and trying to break them down into more simplistic, actionable pieces.
Nice. Well, yeah, and we're kind of in a new spot than where we've been in the past couple of years, where a lot of tech companies and who's to say maybe more in the future, depending on where we go from an economic perspective, are starting to do layoffs. So maybe let's talk a little bit, I suppose, around the psychology that just of layoffs. I mean, what happens when a company lays off and the immediate aftermath, and then we can talk about what to do from there.
Yeah. It's a very interesting time. So having specialized in working with high growth companies and a lot of tech companies over the last 10 years, those companies are still growing, but they're doing so in a totally different macro environment. And the expectations of their stakeholders have drastically changed. The access to resources has drastically changed in a short amount of time. And so, with that, a lot of companies that I work with and a lot of companies in the sector are going through reduction in forces, and some very publicly and some more behind the scenes. But it's a difficult time for a lot of people who are decision makers needing to make hard decisions that impact people's lives, and how to figure out essentially how to sustain or increase productivity and performance in the midst of losing folks, and how do we make sure that people who are staying are still, they have their head in the game and they can actually be productive, because that's one of the major risks when you're going through reduction of force, is that it can spark a fear to filter through the organization, and if in a state of fear, it's very difficult for people to bring their best to their work. So it's a fascinating time. It's, my heart goes out to everyone who is going through it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I love, obviously on the show, we like to focus a lot about what the organization should be doing, but maybe we do start with the individual a little bit here. So the individual who didn't get laid off, I mean, you mentioned fear, and that's obviously the natural response, but maybe not the most productive response, in the long run. What is your advice to that individual?
Really, all of the time, my advice to every person is to manage themselves first. And it is easier said than done. And what I mean by that is notice how you're feeling, notice what your mindset is, and figure out what is it going to take for you to get back to whatever you consider to be aligned with how you want to be showing up. What's the best version of you? What's the best version of yourself at work? What's the impact you want to have? What's the legacy you want to leave or live? And how do you lead in alignment with that? And so that's in my view, your North Star, and you need to get back to that. You kind of, or home base, let's call it. So you need to get back to that home base before you can even start to think about how is it that you're going to start to influence others. And the reason for that is that you can't really influence others if you are what we would call below the line. So there's this invisible line, and when you're above the line, your prefrontal cortex is online, you're feeling good, you're feeling creative, solution oriented. And when you fall below this imaginary line, you're more in a reactive state. So it's fear-based or stress or overwhelm, and you just aren't in a place where you can think creatively. We get very reactive, very judgmental, and everything will feel bigger than it does when we're quote unquote above the line. So first and foremost, get yourself above the line. Maybe it's a couple days away, Maybe you just need a couple late starts. Maybe you need a meeting free day, but you're still online. But figure out what are the little micro decisions you can make so that you can get back to a place where you feel like yourself. And then, and don't make any major life decisions. That's the other thing. People start to feel like they see the world differently and things are changing here. And I don't know if this is what I want. And I just say, just get yourself back to baseline and just literally forget about everything else until you're feeling like that.
Mm. And do you have any advice? Because obviously, one of the things that people fear is that maybe they'll be next, which could very, could be a very true thing. I mean, I don't know if it happens as much today as it did, say, in the late '80s and '90s, where you have these waves of rollouts. So, you'd have one, and then not, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, there's a whole nother wave, and that's what I think a lot of people then are afraid of. So, how do you approach fear and maybe put fear into context so that maybe it's not so debilitating?
That's a great question. I really recommend people focus on what they can control. And so if they don't know if they're going to be next, or they don't know if there's going to be another wave of layoff, the question is, what is it that you know, and how can you focus on that? And usually that's making sure that I'm showing up, demonstrating impact. Maybe I'm thinking about stakeholders that I might want to have touch bases with and building relationships, building bridges. So what are all the things that you can do to basically solidify your role and the importance of your role and the value that you're bringing to the organization? Also, maybe you want to just start thinking about it, not from a fear perspective, but if I weren't working here, where would I want to be? And can I approach this as a moment of opportunity rather than a moment of fear? And that's, again, that's kind of orienting it towards it from a higher point of view with a cleaner or more solid mindset. And usually when I'm talking to folks, there's some opportunity that's been brewing. There's something that they're actually wanting, and so I really encourage people to start to get ahead of it and think about who are those folks outside of your organization, maybe that you want to connect with, or the research that you want to do. And so that you're positioning yourself so this is actually going to be an inflection point that's positive. And the more optimistic we can be, the more likely it will translate into that. And then also just kind of get your ducks in a row, like really kind of cover your bases so that you're not putting yourself individually or your family in a position that you can't sustain. And so
Mm.
those are the things you can control. And then once you've done that, that's what you've done. And so like maybe not, there's not usually productivity goes down a bit in moments of change. And so it's actually probably a good moment to step away. Again, take a day, take a couple days and take care of yourself, tend to yourself, because whatever comes next, whether you're staying and you're going to be one of the fewer people who have more to do, or you're not, and you're going to have some life decisions to make. Either way, you want to be as resourced as you possibly can. So get all the sleep, eat well, like take care of yourself, do all those extra things to tend to yourself so you're ready to go.
Well, and so now let's change a little bit then and talk about from the perspective of um, the manager and having a team of people who maybe are a little shaken up from what just happened with a layoff. What are they thinking about? And how do they need to have a mind shift, if at all?
Yeah, so leading through change is a different skill set than leading in times of stability or even times of growth. So leading through change requires a higher degree of empathy and patience than most people want to allow for. So it's remembering manage yourself first and get ready, because people need basically there's a few things they need. They need for these moments of change to be normalized and help them understand that this is what happens. It's a healthy part of the evolution of businesses and of sectors and of industries. We haven't done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that we won't be here for a really long time, that we've done great work, that we are still and will continue to be successful. This is just what happens. So normalizing it, being empathetic to how they might be feeling is helpful. Providing short-term wins. So yes, it's great to have mission and purpose and 12-month strategic plan. But in times of change, people need to focus on what am I doing today or this week or this month, and how can we celebrate it when we hit those wins? So they need a bit of wind in their sails. So those are some of the things to focus on. And usually those managers are having a lot of meetings with their peers or their leadership team in terms of how are we going to approach this now? How does this impact our strategy? So it can be a time of high level of distraction. And it's really important to be extra present with your people during these times. So even though you're distracted, making sure you're buffering your one-on-ones, you're keeping your one-on-ones, because if you cancel one, that sends a really weird message, especially in a distributed work world. If you're it's time of change, people are getting laid off, and my manager's not showing up to my one-on-one, it has an outsized impact than it would in another environment. So just paying attention to those things and putting yourself in the shoes of the people on the other side and just asking me, like, how are you doing? And just making some space for them to answer as a human before getting down to business or more tactical conversations.
Mm. And and you mentioned that leading in times of change is more difficult than or different maybe than leading in times of stability. So what if you have leaders who aren't good at managing through this type of change? One, how do you see them and notice that? But then two, what as a company, what should you be doing?
I think this is an example of how essential it is to be explicit about what is happening and in leaning in to give a playbook to your people leaders, because the relationships that people leaders have with their direct reports is mostly an extension of the relationship they have with the organization. That is mostly how information is being disseminated to them, in addition to company-wide and public information. So the better the better the relationships they have with their managers, the better managers are in leading through change, the better it is for everyone. So let's get ahead of it. Let's give people a playbook. And so I just rattled off a few best practices, but it's fairly easy to pull people together and give them a few of those and give them the support that they need. So they probably need to connect with peers and have a safe space for saying, oh my gosh, this is so hard, because they cannot go to their direct reports and have that kind of conversation. And so we need to create the forums in which they can kind of have an outlet, a safe outlet, and then give them the instruction they need to be able to move forward.
And what are, I guess, some of the symptoms though that you know like as we think of leaders further and further up that they should be looking for, or just indicators on how the change is going? Because you mentioned there's a drop in productivity, so that should be expected, but then how do they what should they be looking for as like things aren't going right?
Little things that I pay attention to keep a pulse are the number of communications. So what's
Mm,
the pace or the cadence of communication, especially if it's asynchronous, it's easier to get a sense of that. So a lot of my clients use Slack, but others use Teams, others use email, but how much is happening, how much communication is flowing? If things are getting quieter, then I get nervous. I'm thinking, guys, people are not, their head's not in the game. They're not feeling secure. They're not feeling clear, or they're feeling overwhelmed and disengaging. The other thing is if stress levels are getting really high, that's something else that I look
mm,
for. So the level of pressure that people will put on their shoulders in times of change can be too much, and that's unsustainable. It's okay for the people to do that for short stints, but do it consciously and know that there's an end in sight. But if there is no end in sight, we're really burning out our important
mm,
people, the people that we're retaining. And so that's where it starts to become really a business issue. So that those I would address differently. So if communication is getting quiet, it's probably a time to pull the company together, give them a sense of security if we can. If we can't, we can't. But let's be honest, we have to be in integrity and follow through. So if we make a statement, make sure we can hold to it in the coming months. So making sure we're being honest and as transparent as possible. that's important. And it can be a really exciting moment. So if communication is getting really quiet, let's pull the team together and say, we're in it together. This is our team now. We have the best of the best in this room, virtual or physical room. And we have an important mission. I'm so glad that you all were willing to kind of weather the storm. This is a difficult time in the larger scheme of the world, but we're all still here and we get to do this. So there's a bit of a rally that can happen that helps re-engage folks. For the people who are overly stressed and they just can't seem to keep their head above water, they probably need to have a conversation around just priorities, and the company needs to get hyper focused on the top priorities and be willing to let go of the things that are being deprioritized. For people lower in the organization, it's pretty hard to put things down. If you've picked them up and they were previously the priority, it can be really, really hard to stop. But that's what so they'll need help putting it down and feeling that that's not going to put them at risk of losing their job, that really it's okay to put things down in order to focus on the things that are driving business more than any other.
Mm. And talking about productivity, and I guess that leads me to another thought, is a lot of times these organizations, are going through these layoffs um, because of expense. They've got to control expenses. Maybe the profits are being eaten away through higher costs or things like that, things that they maybe can't control, sales down, something like that. And so inevitably, a lot of people will hear, "Oh, we got to do more with less." Which is just that's a disheartening thing to hear, I guess, as an employee. But if that's the direction, and I like where I work and I want to keep working there, or I as a leader have a team and I want to keep my team, we all work well together, and so we got to move forward with this less is more mantra. How do we do that? How do we up our game when maybe we didn't even think we had an issue before?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think we all could literally at any moment pause and look at our workflows and say, okay, how can I work smarter? Not harder, but how can I work smarter, which means accomplishing more, driving more of the things that really matter in less time. And it's a hard thought experiment, but it's a good one for all of us in any moment, and especially for a team who does hear that message that we have to do more with fewer resources or less resourcing. And so it's a time to get creative. I think a common strategy is to get together and do a brainstorm on start, stop, continue. Basically, if we think about how we have been working compared to what we need to be doing in order to stay successful and stay sane and be happy to be here, what are we going to have to change? And let's think collectively about it and communicate it really clearly with cross-functional partners. So there isn't unnecessary expectation. Usually there's some meetings that can fall on your calendar. We all have those recurring meetings and you show up and you're just like not really paying attention. Well, don't go to the meeting, take that time back. And so really try and be a bit ruthless around what is it that is really for you to do or only that you can do it. And there is an element of that that's top down, of making sure that people understand what the priorities are so that they can align around that, or what do we want our culture to be moving forward, and making sure people are rallying around it.
Yeah, we use the stop, start, and continue a lot in project management for the lessons learned. It's a useful exercise, but um, what about I guess even some innovation within that, and trying. Do you have tips on how teams who've maybe not had to innovate before beyond stop, start, and continue, which is great for optimization, but now if we're trying to even maybe revolutionize the way my team does work, whether it's leveraging AI or I don't know, it's always interesting with the new tech advancements, how to get them into that mind, state of mind of doing uh, in being innovative.
Yeah, thinking outside the box, trying new things,
Mm.
things they maybe have never thought of before. Yeah, I love that question. I believe that in order to even entertain new ideas, we need to be in a very generative state of mind. And that can be
Mm,
hard to access when we're moving through our day to day. So, making sure that I either individually or all of us together have enough space, and it doesn't have to be days, but it has to be enough space where I can let go of whatever's happened before. I can really context switch entirely to be fully here. And then are you familiar with the yes and rule
mm, mm,
with brainstorming? It comes from improv, but the idea is I can say the sky is pink and you can't negate me. That's the whole goal, is to not say no, the sky is blue. But if I say the sky is pink and you say yes, and normally people say the sky is blue, and I'll say yes, and right now it's pink because it's, sun is setting, whatever I might say. But the idea is there's no bad idea, and whatever someone throws out, we're going to build on that. We're going to keep taking the best of each idea. And I might say green, you might say something else. And basically, at the end, we're going to be able to arrive at a conclusion that was completely unexpected and none of us could have come up with on our own. And
mm,
probably doing that for a series of sessions. So, having one session, let's go away, do some research, come back. And why I said green. So it's like you say green, I say three, and then we're going to end up at letter C. So, I mean, I'm really talking about taking divergent perspectives or ideas and seeing how we can combine them to arrive at a new conclusion. But having constraints really helps actually with brainstorming and innovation. There's a great book on innovation that talks just about that. It was about the history of Lego and the
mm,
company and how they states have survived throughout many shifts in the macroeconomic environment. So, great book. I think it's called Brick by Brick, and they talk about the importance of constraints. And so, if it's about doing more with less, I would say, okay, constraints. None of us are working more than X number of hours a week. None of us are more
mm,
stressed than we were last month. Those are the constraints. We have
mhm,
to get this amount of work done. We have to drive these results. Okay, those are the constraints. Now let's get creative about how we can go about doing that. And if we
mm,
don't start with the constraints, it can really derail the conversation because people aren't aligned.
yeah. And I guess I'd be really interested to know if you've come across then in your research, any company where the culture really actually ended up thriving after a layoff, or an event like this, and maybe what are some of the things that contributed to that?
I absolutely have. It has all to do with the narrative of what is shared internally, the mindset of the leaders, the energy of the leaders, the optimism of the leaders. I think it's a fabulous thing, honestly. Managed well, there's an opportunity for people to really feel like they were chosen and that they've been
Mm,
invested in and reinvigorated around what their shared mission. So it's an when you have fewer people, it's easier to create a denser culture, meaning people feel
mm,
actually closer to one another because we've lost some of the people in the system. So the system's smaller, and therefore the center of gravity is tighter. And that
mm,
means that we are more agile. So even if we're a large organization, we become more agile because there's fewer of us. But again,
mm,
that's when it's managed well. And in that agility, we're more able to adapt to changing market conditions. And so it can be a really helpful inflection point that a lot of people will look back and be proud that they worked through that together and feel a new sense of momentum and purpose.
mm. That's interesting. And I guess I've heard a couple of times, allude to, you know, layoffs aren't naturally or not necessarily such a bad thing. And obviously when you think of it as at a macro level, there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case. It's better maybe to shrink the workforce than to go out of business or things like that. But I think the general public sentiment tends to be that they're terrible. So would just love to hear, I guess, your thoughts on, is it should those qualifiers be even being attached to layoffs, or how should we even be thinking of them?
I think they're very natural. I think that there's
Mm,
organizations who have them woven into their normal workflow, where people come and people go, and it's a question of fit, and there's performance management in a healthy way. This isn't about blame. It's just about making sure that people are in their right roles and they're set up for success. And that's not going to be the case. We all have a certain tenure in every role or in every organization, and being honest about that's actually great. So there's some that just, as they move through their normal organizational rhythms, have people exiting. Others aren't. They're more growth oriented. So it's more about expansion, expansion, expansion. And so we know that at some point comes contraction. That's the way of the world. So contraction is the most natural thing. It's going to
mm,
happen. And then we're going to expand again. Then we're going to contract, and then we're going to expand. And sometimes it's a decade in between, and sometimes it's 3 months. So I do think reframing layoffs, it's not a sign of unhealthy organizations. I think honestly the opposite. I think what happens is we all have emotions. If someone we
mm,
know gets laid off, it's so hard. It's so hard for them. And if they don't find the right role for them, that's hard. And they might have to make some hard decisions about their life. And so those are
mm,
things we don't want for people that we care about. And so
yeah,
therefore we want to blame the company that they did something wrong. Um,
mm,
and it, and I don't know that that makes the difficulty of the situation disappear. It doesn't, but there isn't really anyone to blame. It's just a hard situation to be in which case we can show compassion and support and lean into being more community minded and helping make sure each person in our world feels taken care of and supported and can help find their next role as soon as possible.
mm. No, it's great. Well, Miriam, this has been a really interesting conversation. I would just love to know what three things you want to leave top of mind with our audience with would be.
I would start with manage yourself first. First and foremost, take care of yourself. Find some little way, maybe literally in this moment as you're listening to this podcast, take a breath, take a sip of water, give yourself the pat on the back for something you've done well in this. So manage yourself and just take care of you, because if you aren't doing it for yourself, you can't do it for anyone else. So really take care of yourself, regardless of where you are, layoffs or not. Just a good rule of thumb. The other one is be aware of the impact you're having on others. I'm a big believer that we're constantly having an impact on those around us. Most of us are completely unaware. We're just asleep. We're not noticing the impact we have on others. And therefore, we're unconscious to choosing what is the impact I want to have. And so I just start to ask people to pay attention to the impact they're having on others. And over time, you can start to choose, like, do you want to leave people feeling better or worse? Probably not worse, but that's what people are doing. So manage yourself, pay attention to the impact you're having on others. And I guess the third thing I'll leave them with is smile. So the one of the ways to find me is leaderswhosmile.com. And that's
Mm,
because I believe that some of the most seasoned leaders can move through even difficult challenges with a smile on their face and feeling like they can right size problems. And that's one of their ways of kind of moving through things with a sense of calm and clarity. And I think that's accessible to more of us. And then that's one of my
mm.
missions, is helping people feel like they can access that anytime.
Nice. And so share your website again, and then if there's any other ways that people can connect with you or things they should know, I'm happy to
Yeah.
hear those too.
Leaderswhosmile.com, and
Mm.
come find me on LinkedIn. Miriam Mima, Miriammea. But Leaders Who Smile is much easier to remember than my name and how to spell it. So that's a
Well,
good place to start.
we'll include it in the show notes. But thank you so much for your time and joining the show today.
Thank you for having me. And thanks for creating this. It is helping so many people.
Oh, thank you. And to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.